Man, I moved everything in my studio around, and now I can't. I don't have the vibes that I like. I used to like having all my wonderful gear or whatever. All right,
What
so
did
we're
you
live
change?
here. I had
What
to
did you
move things
change?
around to make it a bit more efficient. You saw how it wasn't here; it was kind of haywire, and so now I moved some things around. I've all the music stuff, the equipment's in one place. I got multiple screens, only one table. So we ready to go. All right, so we're live here. We got the homie Mr. Dean. We may know him from Black God Pantheon. How you doing, brother? Introduce yourself.
Mr. D. We go through this every time. Mr. D, Black God Pantheon, rapper, educator, writer, bullshit talker, hater of nonsense. That's
All
it.
right, good. Let me make sure I can hear you over here. Uh, I like to keep it live here in the studio. We got Parnhash Smash, Chris Carr, and we got Mr. Dean. We celebrating just life in general. So keep in mind that anyone watching this, we are homies. Even if we don't agree, we are like-minded enough to be in the same room and sharing thoughts. And you had posted something that was really of interest to me and the idea of like role models or examples of blackness. So I don't want to speak for you. Can you kind of give your initial statement or what prompted this conversation?
Oh shit. Let me well first I gotta go back to the post because I don't want to misquote. So hold on. Do we remember what the exact post was? Because I was actually that was
Yeah, this was a while ago, but it was basically about there being a lack of examples for young folks in terms of black men.
yeah. So okay, I'm remembering. I'm trying to see if I can find the actual. I'm scrolling my Facebook page right now to see if I can find the actual quote. But really, um, so I have this question, right? And the question I have is where are there's a lot of criticism um against masculinity, and rightfully so, right? We live in a Eurocentric, uh, male dominated society that approaches masculinity from a hierarchical perspective that doesn't allow for the understanding, the respect, the, the flourishing of women in general, right? But I think that it gets to a certain point where the conversation needs to be a little bit more specific, and we need to incorporate ethnicity into the conversation. And I think that the conversation as it relates to men and the conversation as it relates to black men is very different. It's not the same conversation. And I think that we constantly try to mesh those things together. So I will be very clear, and when I say that this is not a conversation for anybody who does not identify as black, because as far as I'm concerned, the issues that plague the black community, if you don't identify with that community, if you feel as if you live outside of that community, you don't have a say in what happens in that community unless you understand the plight that the people that you're talking about have faced. And I don't think that we take enough time to make sure that there is a general understanding. So I'm looking at the post right now, and I'm going to read it. The post was, I asked for folks to engage in a positive dialogue that brings black men and women together to discuss our issues as a community. No one responded. Um, and what I actually did was I actually posted on Facebook one day video of myself asking folks if they would be open to a conscious, positive dialogue between black men and black women to discuss some of the issues that plague our community. Literally, no one responded. Got no likes except for my immediate Black God Pantheon members. Nobody responded. Okay. When J. Cole versus No Name was happening, everybody responded. When Tory Lanez versus Megan Thee Stallion was happening, everybody was responding. It's very easy for us to say what the problems are and to identify the problems. It's more difficult. It takes more tact, more patience, more understanding, more empathy, and more love to have the conversation and a solution oriented to talk about our trauma, talk about the issues that we are dealing with. I'm gonna go back to the status now. I asked for folks to provide me positive examples of what young and older black men should aspire to help resolve the issues some of our women counterparts see within us. No one responded. And let me clarify with that. In a time and period in which masculinity is wrong. And what I mean by that is toxic masculinity and masculinity is not the same thing, but they constantly get put together. They constantly get thrown under the same umbrella. Okay. In talking about the issues that black men bring, and talking about the issues that black men perpetuate, in talking about what you do, these men, those men, so on and so forth, my question is, who is suggesting what these men should be and what they should aspire to work towards or become? Because I'm in education. So I'm always thinking about this from the perspective of young boys and young girls or young theys, however you want to identify. But I'm always thinking about these conversations from the perspective of youth. And see, we don't realize adults are self-centered and selfish to the extent that we have a lot of conversations, a lot of dialogue, we engage in a lot of activities. We don't realize we're constantly being watched by younger people. So when you're talking down against black men, what are you saying? What messages, what indirect messaging are you sending to the black boys and the black girls and the black kids in general, regardless of how they identify? What messages are you sending? The message you're sending is that black men ain't shit, ain't never gonna be shit, can't be shit, can't aspire to be shit, and if you are a man, you are inherently plagued to be a fuck up. Plagued. I said plagued. Plagued to be a fuck up. We have to have a conversation about that because that's problematic and nobody's looking at it from that perspective. So now let me finish the status. I asked for folks to help highlight critically what some of our disconnects are. No one responded. Yet daily I see posts putting each other down and negatively speaking about each other. I think it's safe to say we are more comfortable existing within conflict than we are discussing tangible solutions for everyday problems. Now, if somebody calls me out on my shit, I have two responses. I can listen or I can defend myself. We rarely listen. We always defend ourselves. We defend our opinions, we defend our thoughts, we defend our posts, we defend what our friends have been through. We rarely try to see it from the other person's perspective. I just happen to be a black man. I grew up, I was the only male in my household. I have a good number of close women, platonic friends that I've never been sexually involved, attracted to, or whatever. I listen. I listen a lot. And I pay attention. I'm not by any means saying I'm the solution. What I will say is that I'm willing to listen. And I'm willing to have an open, honest dialogue that is solution-oriented, that I understand is very difficult for us to have because a lot of what we have to talk about is trauma. And it's not easy to talk about trauma. It's not easy to bring that up in a conversation. So that was the background and the status. That's where I'm coming from. Yeah, that's all I got to say.
Now, I think I responded by trying to give some examples, and it wasn't to disagree with the conflict-oriented nature of a lot of human communication, and it wasn't to try to downplay the idea that in numerous platforms, you don't get support when you start talking positivity, or for some reason people don't engage in active problem solving or in trying to come up with actionable solutions. But also, I am trying to provide, I think, for discussion, the idea of why are the examples that are given to us dismissed? And so whether it's using people that are relatively famous as examples of, I think, strong black male representation, or whether it's people like you as an educator or as a young black man, or with some of the other people we know who are active in community work or actively working with young folks, why they don't count or why somehow their exhibition is maybe dismissed or not considered as viable. And is it safe or is it in totality to say that there are no examples or that there are no people providing examples or stewardship for young folks? And I think it's in a certain way to not forget the folks who are active in community every day. Like when I hear people that are like, well, if Black Lives Matter, black people would be stopping the black on black violence. And I'm sitting there like, you know how many people dedicate their lives to working with young folks and working in the streets and working with gangs and working in anti-violence campaigns and gun control and whatever have you. Now I get the point of people saying, look, there isn't enough being done in our communities and there's too much outside influence bringing in the guns, bringing in the drugs, bringing in the discord and the prison industrial complex and all these other things. But shouldn't we also recognize the community activists? And so I want to make sure then that when we talk about this, we know where you're coming from. So like, what kind of initiated you wanting to post that? I know you've described it, but like, what for you personally were you either experiencing or thinking when you wanted to post that?
I was thinking about my students that are young boys that don't have positive role models outside, positive role models of color that are actively trying to teach them what a transition from childhood to adulthood looks like, and instill in them the type of ideals and morals that they would need in order to be positive, progressive men.
No. Do you mean
And
do you mean in media? Do you mean in real life? Do you mean mainstream media,
so,
journalism? What capacity?
so one of the things you said was like, like looking at community activists and whatnot, right? Like the average kid doesn't know shit about their community activists. The average kid doesn't care. The average kid doesn't know anything outside of what they see in the media. So I was actually talking to somebody about this the other day. Okay. Now, social media, whether we realize it or not, is the main way that our kids socialize. It teaches our kids how to socialize. It teaches our kids how to interact. It teaches our kids what to value, what not to value, what to think about, what to remember, all of these things. So the influence that I have working with a kid for an hour and a half in this class twice a week, yeah, that's a great impact. I give them a homework assignment. We follow up. We talk about your life. I get to know you. You get to know me. Great. I'm one person. I'm one influence in the grand scheme of things. The average kid walking down the block doesn't know shit about local government, community activism, or anything about that. They have to be taught. How many of these people are actually actively going into schools or trying to meet with these famous figures to figure out a way that they can begin to change the narrative? Because I'm thinking about this from the perspective of the kid who just goes onto Instagram and just happens to see a post or a status or an exchange or a dialogue between two people that they admire, that they look up to in the media, and they are just given the wrong ideals. They're not really taught anything. It's one thing to talk to kids about what is wrong, what is right. It's another thing to teach them how to get there. And there's a lot of this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong, this might be right, but nobody's taking the time to teach them how to get there. So it's one thing to look at somebody and say, oh, wow, this guy has a suit on. He's well dressed. Oh, wow, this guy's over here. He handles business. Oh, wow, this guy is like, people respect him. Let me look up to these people. It's one thing to do all of those things, to see all those things, rather. It's another thing to teach folks how to get there. And what I'm saying is, I think that we need an open dialogue, an honest dialogue as a community to start talking about what these things look like or what roles we need to begin to occupy, us, in order to help this transition or in order to help teach these kids. Because the one thing I don't hear is, how do we teach young boys to be men? In a time period where we are understanding that sexuality is on a spectrum, that gender can be on a spectrum, that you can change your gender if you ever so choose. For the boy that wants to be a man, what is he taught? How is he taught? That's the question that I have. It's one thing to say that, anybody can be anything. That's great. My question is, do we just tell folks, yes, just become a great adult and everything else will fall into place? I don't know that that's always going to solve the problem. I don't know that it won't. But these are some of the questions I have.
I mean, with the school that I'm working in, there is a directed and constructed effort to provide resources and attention to Black men. And so I don't disagree with you that the program I work with is probably the anomaly. It's probably the exception. It's not the mainstream, right? And but I wonder how to connect what is available, right? Because there are programs totally oriented to Black men in urban environments. There are programs oriented to quote unquote marginalized communities in urban environments. there are programs, whether it's after school programs, kind of youth internship programs, things of that nature, oriented to Black men. There's a conference called COSBOC, where it's for educators and communities oriented to the success of young Black male students for the most part. And they address some of the things Fuego's talking about in terms of rites of passage and trying to get young Black men to meet other young Black men from different neighborhoods and to work on self-creation and self-identity and working with older generations and intergenerational information exchange. But it apparently isn't enough, or there apparently isn't the connectors. And
So
for the ones that I saw, just real quick to answer Fuegos, and for the ones that I saw, they were run by people who were from Brownsville working with young Black men in Brownsville, or they were from folks who are in Harlem. And maybe some of them, there depends on what you think. Like, you've heard of Eagle Academy, correct? Right. And so and so there's schools like that. And some are a bit more traditional and kind of come out of some type of in a way military idea of, in a perspective, respectability politics. Others are very much more like, yo, wear your t-shirts, speak how you want to speak. I think the school you work at is relatively liberal when it comes to presentation of self. And so how do we connect what's visible? Then how do we create what's not already there? And how do we create interest? Because as a little kid, I was getting so much talk about Blackness in my house. I was tired of hearing it, bro. Like, it's like, man, I already got it. Yeah, the white people are doing this. Yeah, as a Black man, I need to be yada da yada da. Y'all stop beating me in the head with this. And it wasn't until I was older that I kind of appreciated that influence in my life. So kind of, what are your thoughts on that?
So I used to be an after school program director, right? And we had programming that was specifically geared towards young men. This was the conflict with that in hindsight, right? So it's me, it's a couple other people that I'm working with that are very much aware socially of some of the issues that are plaguing our community and have plagued our community from a historical perspective. And, like, really wanted to take the time to talk to these kids about just being a man. And what should you value? What should you focus on? What should you think about? Right? But on one hand, this is something that's not focused on. The definition of gender is changing. The way we interpret it has changed. 2020, the conversation around masculinity and what a good man is not the same 10 years ago. So I would argue that, well, my question would be, how many of these organizations are moving with the times? And going back to my personal experience, see, the conversation can only get so far when you're working within certain organizations. Because I'll use my example, right? Our program was run by all people of color. And in fact, every program that I've ever worked in was run by people of color. The difference is that they're not funded by people of color. Which means that if they're not funded by people of color, the funding is only going to support a specific mission or a specific goal. Period. So a lot of times we are working within the constraints of certain systems that inherently are not for us anyway. It's almost like we'll give a nigga a little bit of shit, but we're not going to give him everything. And that's been my personal experience. So that doesn't necessarily answer your question. I'm really doing more of identifying issues with the current systems that are in place, right? I think it needs to be a little bit more local. I think that folks like you, folks like myself, I see Phantom is in the comments and whatnot, and other individuals, like, we need to come together and start talking about, the first thing is we need to define what manhood is in 2020. So it's one thing for this organization to talk about this and this organization to talk about this, but we have to define manhood, and that's a difficult task to do right now. That's the problem. I think the first goal is to try to develop a shared definition for what manhood is. And that could mean that all of these organizations identify time to come together and have an open forum. That means that we have a conversation as men of color to have an open forum to talk about our trauma, our past, our family history, our relationship history, our interaction with our friends. These are all of the things that need to come into the conversation. This is a multi-layered conversation that has to be had. That it can't happen in one part, it can't happen in two parts. There's no overnight solution, but but we all need to come first together to talk about our experiences to create a shared definition. If we don't have a shared definition, we're not working towards anything. And I think that's part of the problem, specifically when I look at boys. Like, I don't know that people look for this. I know I do. When I look into the heart, into the eyes of these kids, they are walking around without direction. And the reason why they're walking around without direction is because look at the music they listen to. Look at the media that we are exposed to. Look at the conversations that we are exposed to. We don't realize that we're actually socialized to not have a good attention span. Social media lets us not have a good attention span. So if something is bothering us or if something makes us uncomfortable, we can just move, shift, we're gone. We're not looking at it anymore. And that's what we're dealing with. We're dealing with a generation of people, and we're included in this. We are involved in this, where we don't have to think or focus on something for too long. We just don't have to. We can move on to something else. And what I'm saying is that we have to start focusing on more and on everything, as opposed to just letting shit go. Because because right now we're working against each other. I'm all for, anybody who knows me know I'm all for people living however they want to live. You do whatever the fuck you want. But what I'm telling you is that in this conversation of what men are doing wrong in in gender fluidity, which I don't have a problem with, to be clear, because motherfuckers will try to spin the shit, right? Like, in that conversation, men, young boys, are not being fed positive definitions or example or positive rhetoric of what that is. And to go back to your point, Chris, I would argue that constantly getting fed negative rhetoric is 1,000 times more powerful than meeting with Mark and James and Andre once a week at a fucking program.
Now, just taking the position of people I've heard is that in general, no matter what your background is in this country, patriarchy is celebrated, and that this isn't my opinion. This is something I'm just putting forth to discuss, is that there are so many images of a quote unquote an Obama in politics, a quote unquote Diddy, or a successful business person in entertainment, a quote unquote Bob Johnson in television and media, a quote unquote Don Lemon, or someone in news cycle or something like that. That you have non-men saying that men are still constantly celebrated, still constantly being reinforced. Masculinity is not being attacked, and the hypersexuality is still strong. The hyperviolence is still strong. The idea that men are infallible is still strong. Now, why is it that? Hold on, just quick question, Anson. Hold on, let me get you was riding for a second. Let me get on the horse real quick. Why is it that we're getting such different messages? It would be my first question. It's not to deny the truth of what you're saying, but something's going on so that other people are thinking the exact opposite. Other people are saying, yo, all day, young black men are getting reinforced with the idea of their behavioral patterns are totally acceptable and reinforced to say that that's what quote unquote success looks like. And then other folks like you and I might say, like, no, we're getting bombarded with negative images, and that does have deleterious effects on a community at large. And often they're generated by people outside of our community. Mm-hmm. And so it's joke, it's entertainment, it's money and profiteering, while our communities suffer from it. And so how is it that people are getting such different messages?
So we're getting mixed messages. So let's go back to what I said earlier, right? That this isn't a white and black conversation. This is a black conversation.
Correct.
Right. Now, we black people are living in a cultural situation that is inherently not our own, to the point that we have taken on behaviors and activities and beliefs that are not our own. A white man and a black man, you put them in the same room, they don't have the same privilege. A white man and a black man, if you put them in the same situation, they are not received the same, they're not looked at the same, they're not taken the same, they're not respected the same. Period.
Quick question. Do you think in society, though, black men still have more access or power than non-men that are black?
I'm gonna say something that people are not gonna agree with me on. I think that's a falsehood, and I think it's bullshit. And the reason why I think it's falsehood and the reason why I think it's bullshit is really this whole conversation. Because black men are not told what they should aspire to be. We told not to be like this guy, not to be like this motherfucker. So what are we supposed to be? Regardless, at the end of the day, we don't reap the benefit of white privilege. Black women don't reap the benefit of white privilege. If you take a black man in a room and a white woman in a room, the likelihood of the white woman going to get the job before the black man is very high. As somebody who's been in, like, I've seen the shit. I'm not just pulling ideas out the crack of my ass. So going back to this whole idea around toxic masculinity and this whole idea, like, I could sleep with her, do whatever I want, not respect her, based on what I was taught and the shit that I've read, that is not an Afrocentric ideal or concept or way of life. It's a Eurocentric one, which means that living in this Eurocentric society, we have taken on Eurocentric ideals, beliefs, and behaviors that we are enacting on a day-to-day basis that are not inherently our own. Part of the problem with our people is that we don't know ourselves enough, we don't know our history enough to reclaim our identity and to reclaim our regular behavior and regular activity. That's part of the issue. We don't know who we are. So a lot of these dudes are walking around doing shit. That's part of the reason why our relationships are disarray and all over the place, because we are approaching them from a perspective that doesn't work for us, that will never work for us, and has never worked for us. We also have to take into consideration just the dynamic between black men and women that happened during the 70s and 80s following the crack era and following the incarceration of a lot of the black leaders that were men. There was something systemically done to us and done to our interaction that we don't pay attention to.
I think.
I don't know if you're like.
So I totally agree, and I think one of the screen for you is blurring, but I could hear your audio fine. Let me know if you can't hear me properly.
No, I can hear you. You're good. I didn't know if you were like, I didn't know if you were stolen or what.
No. I can hear you. The video is kind of stuttery, but I think you bring up a very serious issue of purpose, and that there was concerted effort to roll back any gains made by different communities of African descent, and whether or not that's when you look at the drug introduction with some of the prison industrial complex work and how that's systematically done to break apart black families, and that ties into a history of destroying black family and connection. There's a book by Chancellor Williams, Destruction of Black Civilization, and it kind of goes into from West Africa into bringing folks over here, and then the social scenarios that black people were forced to be in. And it kind of gets, I think, parallel to that is when we manage concepts of manhood, we're dealing with how do groups that are dealing with generational trauma then identify, manage their trauma, and not take on the imposition of the oppressor group, and to not be defined by that trauma or that oppressor group. So in a certain way, how do you define yourself as a black person separate from slavery, but still recognize the influence of slavery in America? Because there's some people that would say you don't want to teach little kids that blackness is tied to slavery, because then that's a position of subjugation, and we should teach them prior to slavery, the people that were here outside of slavery, what Africans did before the Europeans were involved in certain ways. But then also make sure young people understand that in America, slavery influenced how we end up with the police the way they are now, land ownership, social roles, things of that nature. So how do you address that duality of things and like not tell kids basically, like you said, if you're a man, you are going to be violent and oppressive towards women, but then also recognize that even in the civil rights movement, there was a predilection to put the male perspective first, seemingly, even though we know that there were women heavily involved in the civil rights movement.
So that's a lot that you just asked. Now I'm actually looking for a paper that I wrote some time back.
That's what I like. I bring on a guest and they like, let me go to the document that I wrote. Hold on, we got to quote.
Yeah, because I don't like talking out the crack of my ass, and I feel like we're you know, if we're gonna talk, then let's talk. So while I look for it, because I don't want to waste time. So really, the question is, it sounds like the question is, how do we teach Black youth about the I guess the positive sides and the positive examples of their history without talking about slavery? Is that it?
Or how do we deal with the reality of not continuing conflictual notions, like talking about the civil rights movement, addressing the fact that it seemed so male oriented in presentation, recognizing and celebrating the non-men involved, but also trying to move forward and say, where were the queer voices in the 60s? Where were the women that were next to these men, but not seen on the forefront?
So it's funny because there's a teacher at my school who was actually teaching a class around basically queer people that have queer. I don't know if they were focusing on the 1900s up until the present, or if it was like the Harlem Renaissance and the civil rights movement. But basically, it was like queer identities through history, right? And it was particularly focusing on people of color, right? And I also think that, so I think that's one way, right? Create situations in which we teach the kids about them. But so what I was taught, and I don't have any specific references, I'm still looking for it right now, but what I was taught was that most ancient Black civilizations, if you focus on particular, I mean, a lot of people talk about Egypt, right? So the Kemites, and then the Kushites, right? So the ancient Ethiopians, right? A lot of people, from what I was taught, and this is, once again, I'm not giving any references, this is what I was taught, feel free to challenge, whatever, that our societies were not patriarchal.
Right.
They weren't necessarily matriarchal either. It depended on where you were, but there was more of a balance. If you look at the Kemetic concept of Mayat, which stands for truth, reciprocity, and justice, the idea of balance and equity across the board, and start to operate from that perspective, meaning that one cannot exist without the other. Left cannot be without right. Male cannot be without female. Up cannot be without down. There's a balance. There's an approach that you have in looking at some of this stuff and looking at some of the conversation. So I would argue that you start as far back as you can go with the conversation. So if you have knowledge about the Kemites, then use that. If you have knowledge about the Kushites, then use that. If you have other information that speaks to our ancient greatness, then use that. But be very clear in your focus, in the sense that it was not patriarchal. It was not matriarchal. It was not about one being better than the other. It was about understanding the balance between both and the necessity of both. You can't have a flower without the seed. You can't. And one cannot be without the other. So just to answer your question real quick, what I'm saying is it has to start as far back as you can go, and then really look at slavery. Look at the fact that slavery was a fucking crazy situation that was dominated by white masculinity, and that did everything it could to destroy the family. Because you need to understand where we came from, what we went through, and what we're dealing with right now in order to understand the full story. You can't focus on this part, this part, and that part, because it becomes segmented and you think that it was only about this. It's part of the reason why a lot of our kids are like, oh shit, we started in slavery, because they're only hearing about that, only hearing about one section of the history. It doesn't mean you only focus on the ancient history. You focus on all of it. And we don't want to focus on all of it. We think that we can focus on this and that's enough. No, everything is a part of it. Everything. I'm gonna shut up. Smile.
No, not. So I think it's also important to note then that in creating a program or creating understanding that is directed towards young Black men, it's not a dismissal of non-men, and that it's just a recognition of special attention needed towards a group of folks that aren't getting the attention necessary. And I think the reason I wanted to ask you about this is to clarify, because people think, well, if you're focused on Black men, you by definition are then not concerned with Black women or not concerned with Black trans folks. And no. I think in you taking this holistic approach of saying like, nah, you actually can be aware of the necessity for all elements of the Black family, but we're specifically going to talk about this for a moment.
Yes. I mean, I think that
is that more so like what you're saying?
My thing is this: Black is Black.
Okay.
Black is Black, and see, this is see. I understand why we need to say Black trans people. I understand why we need to say Black women. But when I talk, me, Mr. Dean, when I say Black, I mean everybody under that umbrella. Period. That's what I'm talking about. So I never am gonna specify trans, women, men. I'm gonna say Black, and I mean all of us. Period. That's it. I'm not, because this compartmentalization, this separatist approach to things. Internally, we don't need it. I can have a conversation with anybody Black, gay, trans, lesbian, queer, straight, heterosexual, whatever label you identify under. I can have a conversation with you. You're a person. You're a spirit. You are an individual. And everybody that is a spirit and an individual deserves anything that anybody else can possibly ask for. Period. So even in me being this way, in terms of when I say Black, I mean everybody, I genuinely feel that's what we need to move towards. We're hurt. And whenever somebody says, oh, but me, and what about this person? What you're really hearing is hurt and pain. And the fear of being ignored, the fear of being assaulted, offended, hurt. That's what we're dealing with. We're all in pain right now. And we are all hurting right now. Regardless of orientation, regardless of gender, regardless of where you live.
So with that in mind, what are some of the things in us as just two people here trying to come to an understanding of how do we want to phrase or frame the concept of masculinity in 2020? For you, what is it to be a man? If it's more than your biological sex, or if it's more than your sexual preference, or if it's more than the gender you choose to express, where do we start rooting the experience of being a young man, adolescent, and coming out of boy to manhood?
I think that that's a question that I can't answer on my own. I think that's a question that we need to answer as a community, because it's not, my opinion is my opinion, right? Like I can be traditional at times with the way that I approach malehood or manhood. And not from the perspective of like hierarchy, just from the perspective of somebody who doesn't think that there's something wrong with gender roles as long as they are presented without hierarchy. And that gender roles don't need to be blanketly put, if that even is a word, blanketly put on every relationship that exists. It can change. right? Like, I think that we need to come together to create that definition, because my definition of a man is my definition of a man. It's what I live to be as often as I can. But I don't know that that works for our entire community at this particular point in time. I have my theories, but I don't know that I'm correct, and I don't want to assume that I am. You know, I don't know if that makes sense.
I
I don't
mean,
know if I don't
it's
know if
something
that.
that's it is actually. I appreciate that honesty in saying that an individual trying to transpose or extrapolate what an entire community of tens of millions of people should be is kind of absurd suggestion, but it starts a conversation. Like when I think of maleness and black maleness, one of the things that I've come to accept for myself is no matter what I do, it's an expression of masculinity. And because I'm a man, I was born a man, I've lived as a man, I identify as a man. If I wear fishnets, men wear fishnets. Black men who are straight, and whatever that means to people, I only engage physically with women, wear fishnets, and people be like, "Oh, well, that's gender fluid," and it's like you call it what you want. For me, it's male, and that men can wear fishnet stockings. Other people are going to be like, "Nah, that's not for this and that." I can't let other people dictate my understanding of my maleness or masculinity, but I know my opinion is possibly more loose or fluid than other folks. And I don't mean to associate their traditionalism with you, but like I used to live in Georgia, and so there's some old black men where being a man is very specific and it's very clear. And then you got folks on the West Coast, you got folks in the Midwest, you got people in towns, cities, rural, and they have such different experiences and expressions of what maleness should be. And in my mind, it's like, well, whatever we do, we do. It's all black maleness. But when we start creating an idea of what it should be, that's where it gets difficult, because now I have to say it's something more legitimate than another. Am I okay with the kids on the train got their pants hanging off their ass and can barely communicate with each other without yelling? At a certain point, why am I mad at them? Like, I got other things to be mad at. On the other hand, do I know that being able to communicate with one another and manage conflict is possibly beneficial for us as black men? And am I missing something in how they communicate that I can appreciate? Or am I, in a way, enabling things that have detrimental effects in our community? And so it's of interest to me to talk to other black men about the reality of what is, but then what could or should be.
See, I'm
And so, I
see,
mean, do you
bro.
have any?
Yeah, well, I'll give you an example. My dad, right? My dad was born and raised in the South, right? Born and raised in the South. So you're talking about very traditional ideas as it relates to what a man is, right? This is what I think the issue is. I think the issue is hierarchy. I think the issue is hierarchy and prejudice and not understanding that people can be individuals. I don't think the issue is gender roles. Like, for example, I don't think telling a man to carry his mom's bags or his girlfriend's bags or his sister's bag, I don't think that's wrong. It's a gender role. I don't think it's wrong. I think it's wrong when it's imposed. It's wrong when you say women for themselves. It's wrong when you approach it from the perspective of, oh shit, you can't do this, so I'm gonna do it for you. That's hierarchy. Can you be that way without hierarchy? That is my question. I don't know that people are at that point where they can do certain things without hierarchy. Give you an example. I know gay men that will not let a woman carry her bags because they believe that a man, regardless of their orientation, should still carry bags. The problem isn't the gender role. It's the hierarchy that comes along with it. That's the problem. So, to each his own. You wear fishnets, I ain't putting on fucking fishnets. I'm not interacting with you any differently. you're still a friend of mine. As far as I'm concerned, I'm just not wearing the fucking fishnets. And when you wear them, motherfucker, do your thing. Like, you know what I'm saying? I'll be over here not wearing them. You'll be over there wearing your shits. Whatever. Like, I'm not judging you because of it. I'm not looking at you as less of a person because you're doing it or less of a man because you're doing it. The problem is the hierarchy. The problem is we don't know how to be comfortable in what we are and not say you should be comfortable with it as well. You don't have to be comfortable with what the fuck I do. But we want to make everybody comfortable with everything that we do. That's where this whole PC shit comes from. Everybody has to be politically, like, no, not everybody has to feel the same way and think the same thing or be on the same page. That's where the hierarchy comes in. We don't realize how ego-driven we are. Or the fact that we don't deal with our own trauma, so we impose our shit on other people. Just because somebody did some other shit doesn't mean you have to correct them. That's why I don't really like fucking putting statuses on Facebook. Because there's always somebody wants to come in and correct you. Like, shut the fuck up. Just, I have my status, you have your status. Live your life, I'll live mine. We don't have to always correct each other. But if we're going to take the time to want to correct each other, then we need to be willing to have an open and honest conversation. It can't, like, you got to pick one. And that's where I'm coming from. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, I'm going to open the door for her. I'm going to carry her bags. It's not to say that she can't do it herself. That's how I was raised. If I'm wrong for that, she will tell me. And that's our conversation within our dynamic. I had a girlfriend, she never wanted to carry her own bag. She wanted me to carry it. Because that's how she was raised. But she also has gay and trans friends. So I don't think the roles are the issue. I really think it's the hierarchy and the fact that we are not okay all the time with being ourselves. We want validation. So we have to start this healing conversation. And I know a lot of us are not ready for that. But this is more of an emotional, self-analytical, trauma-revealing conversation than we want to admit or realize.
Well, I think it's timely, right? At least for me, and that I am understanding why people are having difficulty communicating and why people feel hurt. I see a status from one friend who's like, Black women are never loved, supported, or protected. I see another post from a friend who say Black men are never loved, protected, or have a space to emotionally share. I see another post where Black, trans, gay, queer folks are never protected or unsafe and are the most targeted in society. And when a person says, what are we going to do to love each other? Sometimes the response from the women are like, well, Black men need to stop beating us up before you start talking that love shit. Or you start getting other folks who are like, well, as a Black man, I need to stop being told I'm the worst thing on the planet. And it's still that. And so how do we recognize the trauma we each have and may have contributed to while then building and loving one another? And I think that's really the important part of this conversation is, in a way, teaching young Black boys and Black men and Black adolescents that are male how to love each other, how to love other people in the community, how to love ourselves, and also recognize the work we have to do on ourselves. And so
You're talking about conflict resolution 101 right there.
And now you're getting into, in our society, we aren't taught conflict resolution. We're told, at least where I grew up, it was like, what the fuck you looking at?
Mm-hmm.
We taught, you bump me, we escalate. We don't de-escalate.
Mm-hmm.
And so maybe that's part of what in us creating an understanding of maleness or masculinity is this idea of being able to dig into our traumas and start building the bridges, even if it's not all smooth yet, even if there still is some conflict, and putting in that time or effort to resolving that conflict within ourselves and us as young Black men.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the reason why I say conflict resolution 101 is because the problem is listening or not listening, if you really think about it. Because, like, let's say you're in a relationship, right? And somebody brings a problem to you. And they say, I don't like that you cut me off when we're having debates. And you say, yeah, but when we were talking last week, you cut me off. So why is it an issue? That's the dynamic that you just described. It's a problem is brought to you and you say, yeah, but what about, as opposed to just listening to what the person is trying to bring to your attention. And we're not listening to each other. Everything that you just said is that people don't feel protected. Regardless of your orientation, Black people don't feel protected. That's what I heard. Black people in general don't feel protected. So it's time for us to talk about why. Women, I understand why. Men, I understand why. Trans people, I understand why. But even with my understanding, I can still understand more. I can still be taught more. I can still be told more. So we need to stop with that, because the one, like the example you gave when you were like, yeah, but everybody needs to love each other, yeah, but Black men need to stop beating us up. That comment goes into an ethos somewhere that nobody can ever work on. Nobody can fix that. Nobody can help that. You just sound angry, and you should be angry. You should be upset. But also know and be aware that when you do things like that, you're deflecting. You're deflecting. You're not looking inward to say, all right, well, am I loving everybody that's around me? Because it's not about Black men in that moment. If somebody says that we need to love each other, you need to look inside yourself and say, well, am I loving people? Can I love? Am I capable of love? Do I know what love is? Have I been loved? Have I felt love? Those are the questions you really should be asking before you start pointing the finger at who's beating y'all up. It's fucked up. I know of a few women that have been or are in abusive situations with Black men. I know some women that are the abusers in their relationships with Black men. It's across the board. We're all fucked up. And anybody who thinks pointing the finger at somebody else is going to help, it's not going to work. It's not going to work. See, even within the midst of the conversation around racism, right? At some point, you have to ask yourself, well, what have I done to combat this system or to work within this system to make it happen? It can't always be shit's racist, shit's racist, shit's racist, shit's racist, right? You got to ask yourself, what the fuck did you do? And it's the same thing when it comes to dealing with relationships or dealing with the dynamic between men and women or anybody that's in between. Like, you can't just blame folks. You can't. We have to take responsibility, or what will be more productive is list what has been done to you so we can together create a list of solutions.
So I think that brings me kind of an idea of, we aren't the first people to ask these questions, right? And there are generations of people. Every generation, people have these kind of conversations and push society forward. So are there examples of Black men you learned from that influenced your development as a Black, either child, adolescent, or now as a Black man?
Yeah. Well, my pops, my father, first and foremost, because that was like my first example. My father, my one of my uncles, godfather, um, and then when I was in college, I had two professors, two Black studies professors, which were Black men that I was particularly close to, while I was in college, that did a lot to help shape my understanding of Black history, Black psychology, sociology, and just the role that we need to play in each other's lives. I was also fortunate enough to go to a school that was very much liberal, in the sense that we had annual Black Solidarity Day workshop retreats, where we would just discuss issues that particularly plagued the Black community. We would have about 4 different workshops we would cycle through. them, and they will all discuss different topics as it relates to what the Black community was dealing with at the time. And that was a lot of what shaped my development when it comes to my awareness of some of our situations. But even in that, I was, I've also been taught, and I think that a lot of the people that I just mentioned, whether it be my family members or teachers or professors that I've had, that they've always instilled in me this idea that no matter what you know, you don't know it. No matter what you don't know, you can know more. Anybody who knows something doesn't know anything. So this idea that, like what you just said, right? Like, oh, like I grew up in a household where all this blackness, so I don't need to hear it anymore. No, that's bullshit. Like, because you're associating it with a rigorous lesson that you got when you were a kid, right? But it's still information that you still have to build upon because you weren't given everything. Even what you were given was from the perspective of the person who was teaching it to you. There's still more out there that you can learn. I'm not saying this to you directly, Chris. I'm just saying in general, like, like there's always something more. So even this idea, like these people, they instilled in me this idea that there's always more for you to learn. You can never learn everything in one sitting. And there's always information out there that you haven't gotten yet. So yeah, like those are my influences, and those are the things that they instilled in me. Not to mention that you're supposed to just treat people with respect regardless of who they are. It don't matter if they man, woman, trans, questioning, queer, whatever. Like, you treat people as an individual regardless. Like you're not the most high. You don't have the ability to shun or condemn or damn people. Like, so yeah.
It's something that weaves in and out of my life, in the sense of even working at the high school where we're at. One of the Spanish speaking kids, his family's from Mexico, and we got into a conversation about the history of slavery in America. And he was like, well, how come we always talk about slavery and what happened to black people? And with Mexicans is this, and it turned into almost this conflict in class between the people of African descent and the people who weren't. And at a certain point, I came in maybe a day or two later, and I was like, yo, I heard about your conflict. Why are you doing a comparison? Why aren't we learning about the history of how colonialism affected both people of Mexican orientation and people who are of African descent? And you ever heard of the Olmecs? And the kid looked at me, he's like, what you talking about? And I'm like, you ever heard of the Arawak, the Taino? And he's like, what you talking about? And I was like, the areas where people now speak Spanish, that's colonial. Who was there beforehand? Aren't there black Mexicans? And he looked at me like, yeah. So I'm like, so why are you saying it's either or, like black people or the Mexicans? And we started trying to break down, creating more solidarity through the conversation than conflict. But I know part of what they expressed was something I had expressed, which is we tired of hearing the same thing. Martin Luther King did this. Malcolm X was so-and-so. We know it. And when I started talking to him, I was like, well, did you know about Martin Luther King's socialist platform? And they looking at me like, what? No. His anti-Vietnam War stuff. What? No. We know that he won a Nobel Prize and he did a march on Washington and a letter from the Birmingham jail. And I was like, so maybe it's not that you tired about learning it. It's that you actually aren't getting information. You're getting like this surface level, let's just say it so that we can pass you through this school program. But we need actual depth of information. We need actual variety of perspectives on some of these topics to keep it fresh. Because like, yeah, at 42, I'm still learning. At 40, whatever, I'm still meeting people and learning from their backgrounds and their investigations. And, I went to Morehouse, bro. So like I got lucky. In 96, there was no internet, but I was meeting 5%ers that had the notebooks full of the history of the world according to 5%ers. I was meeting people from the Holy Tabernacle. I was meeting Rosses. I was meeting Baptist kids who were preachers at 13 years old from wherever in Mississippi. I was meeting such a wide variety of black men and was friends with a lot of different types of people that I would and realized there was so much more to learn that even 20 years later, when I saw your post, I wasn't like, man, here we go again. I was like, you know what? I need more. I need to keep having this conversation with people that care. And I'm glad you took it from, let's not go back and forth on Facebook. Let's have a conversation. Let's present that conversation to other people. And let's actually dialogue on this. Let's actually build from this, as opposed to pick and just pop shit on the internet.
I hate doing that. I really don't. I can't. I really don't get how people do it. Like, I don't understand how people just type statuses and responses and responses and responses. I could have wrote a whole fucking book and all that typing that I just did on Facebook. That's just how I feel. Like if I'm going to type that much, I might as well write a fucking book. Like I don't understand that shit. Or write a fucking paper and submit it to a newspaper or something. Like I really don't understand it. It's counterproductive. I don't believe that Facebook or any of these platforms were used for that type of discussion or that level of discussion. It's a fucking status. You comment and you keep it moving. You know when when I post shit, when I'm traveling to work or back from work or I'm waiting for my fucking food to finish cooking. Like those are the times in which I have time to post a status. If anybody, I'm just public service now. If anybody thinks I'm reading your essay, you are sadly mistaken. Call me, have a dialogue, let's have a conversation. I don't believe in that shit. I think it's counterproductive and it's a waste of time and it's more ego-centered than we think it is. Because you just want to, no, prove this motherfucker wrong. Prove this motherfucker wrong. No, you're not going to give me, nah, what is that about? Like, let's build. Let's have an actual conversation. How much, communication is 98% nonverbal, right? How you going to communicate on the internet? How? If it's not in video. You can't.
It's definitely not visual, yeah.
It's not, you're not getting the full message. You're not getting the full person. You're not getting the full thought. I don't know how you write. I don't know how you're saying it in your head when you type me that shit. I'm reading it in my voice. So I'm literally reading it in my voice unless I know you super well. I can just throw in your intonation, your diction, and everything. Like I'm not doing that. I'm not doing that. I think that conversations like this that are about something that is plaguing tons of people, respect it enough to give it a full platform. It's really about respect. It's about respect for the topic and respect for the people you're choosing to communicate to. That's my take on it. It's almost disrespectful to expect me to want to fucking debate with you 5 hours on Facebook all goddamn day when I have a job and I work with kids and I have to read their writing and read their papers and read their poems. Like that's what I read. I don't want to read your shit. Sorry.
Now, for people who are watching this, also know that I use Facebook as an art project. And folks want to hit me with the like, Chris, you trolling, da da da. Nah, I actually find it to catalyze these type of discussions. So Anson posts something, I go back and forth, and then he sends me a note like, can we talk about this? I don't want to do back and forth. We figure out a way to make it happen. Other people are afraid to speak to me in person, or other people are afraid to have these one-on-one conversations. I use Facebook. I appreciate you having this conversation, Anson. We've been going for about an hour. What it makes me think is maybe building with some of the other folks in our community, and even if it starts out on a small scale, of doing something in real life oriented to youth and Black maleness, Black masculinity, and starting to exchange the communication and starting to work with the youth is in the room. Because again, I'm old, kind of. I'm young at heart, and motherfuckers don't try to see me out here because I got the fire. Don't try to. I am not retired out this motherfucker. Anybody catch the smoke, but we got us as older people out here talking about it. Maybe we do something in real life with some youth involved and some people older than us, and work that intergenerational communication. Is that something you'd be interested in?
Yeah, actually, the same day I posted that status. I don't know, was it the same day or the day after? I was on the phone with the brother McCall on me for at least we were on the phone for about an hour and a half, 2 hours talking about the status. We were talking about doing something along those lines, where we just brought really like an intergenerational group of Black men together to have an open dialogue about what this conversation, like really like what we need is everything to hash it all out. So yes, to answer your question,
Okay,
I think that's the first step, right? To bring together a group of Black men, older, younger, our age, whatever. And that's the first step. And then we probably would need to do that a couple of times. And then eventually we need to also bring women into the conversation, right? Because we can't have this conversation without them. And also think that men need to hear their trauma and they need to hear other people's trauma. And I think that we all need to hear all of it because it's not one-sided. It's not one sided. We got to remember that people do things that they were taught to do. That's it. We are humans. We are beings of habit and conditioning, and culture, of course. But a lot of the stuff that we engage in was taught to us. So instead of, like, for example, if from an educational perspective, right? If you're working with a student and they're presenting certain things that you don't necessarily want them to present, behaviors, discipline issues, right? You're not going to blame the kid for what they're doing. That's counterproductive. A kid does what they were taught to do. So you have to look at what they're doing and get them to see why it's problematic and hope that they will reverse the behavior or fix it. But you can't blame them for it, because blaming is going to make them feel bad. It's going to make them retreat. It's going to make them not feel connected to you. And that's it. It's the same thing when you're dealing with individuals. And that's the problem. We're not treating each other as students of life and as individuals. And granted, not everybody's willing or open to learn. I get it. I know that. I'm not always willing and open to learn. I can be very stubborn at times. I get that, right? But we need to at least be open to the conversation. And that's where it has to start.
Word. Well, I appreciate that, brother. Before we head out, people do know you as an educator, clearly know and engaging in this from that perspective. But you dropped a recent music piece. So before we head out, how can people find your music?
Oh shit! Damn, that's what we done. All right, but so yeah, nah. So I dropped the project in August 24th, I believe. Called Here Nigga, a letter from me before now. It's a project that I recorded between 2012 and 2015. So it's like all old shit. But I really wanted to get it out. It's kind of like a therapeutic spring cleaning type of vibe for the summer in preparation for the fall. And you can really find it anywhere. Your preferred streaming service. So that's Apple, that's Spotify, Tidal, Amazon, Google Play, YouTube.
What's the name by which people can find you online for your music?
Mistha Dean, Mistha Dean, Dean. You can search for me that way, and things will come up.
Bet. All right. Well, I appreciate it. This has been another. I guess this counts as a Just for My People conversation. I'll be posting this on Facebook. It was running live. If I can make my computer act right, I'll try to download this and get it up on YouTube as well. At this point, you're like one of the correspondents, bro. It's always fun bringing you on. It's a great conversation. And this conversation dwelled in this idea of like Black masculinity and examples of Black maleness and whether they're enough and what they are and what we can do to provide more for the youth. So I appreciate you bringing that topic up. And shout out to everyone who watched, who participated. We'll see y'all soon.
Appreciate you, man. Definitely. Made you look. Black Lives Matter.
Now, this hat's about the meaning, not any organization. It's about the idea. I don't even want anybody coming at me yelling about George Soros.
Next conversation, ghosting ass Trump supporters. Are your friends Trump supporters, and are they lying to you about who they fucking support? Find out next week in the comments.
No, because it's about to be real. All right, y'all be safe out there. Appreciate you.
Man, you're ready.
All right, much love.
Yeah.